The sun hung heavy over the Brazos Valley on August 14, 1943, its noonday heat turning the barbed wire fences of Camp Huntsville into molten silver. Behind those fences, 100 German prisoners of war stood in stunned silence, their voices rising in astonishment as a column of Texans rode past on horseback. Broad-brimmed hats tilted low against the sun, rifles resting easy in saddle scabbards, dust rising in golden plumes from the hooves of horses that gleamed like polished copper in the harsh light. "Are you real cowboys?" one of the prisoners shouted in broken English, laughter mixing with disbelief. The Americans tipped their hats and laughed back, and for a fleeting moment, the distance between victor and captive dissolved in a haze of heat and curiosity. For the men behind the wire, veterans of the Africa Corps who had fought under Ronald's son, it was the first time they had seen the myth of America come to life. The land they had been told was decadent, chaotic, and weak was suddenly revealed as vast, ordered, and alive, with a confidence that defied imagination. In that moment, something began to crack deep inside them. It wasn't the sound of defeat, they had heard that already in the desert, but the first whisper of revelation. They had not just lost a war. They had stumbled into another world. The story of how German prisoners of war discovered that the real power of the United States wasn't in its armies or its factories, but in its people, is a story of transformation. It is a story of how, behind barbed wire under the Texas sun, enemies became witnesses to the soul of a free nation. The smoke still hung over the Tunisian hills like a funeral shroud when Oberfeldwebel Karl Briner laid down his rifle and waited for the order to surrender. The Afrika Korps, once the pride of Hitler's war machine, was finished. The sand was littered with the wreckage of burned panzers, shattered half-tracks, and the bodies of men who had believed themselves invincible. The desert wind carried the acrid scent of fuel and defeat. Briner, his uniform stiff with sweat and dust, watched the distant silhouettes of American trucks rolling toward them, each one gleaming in the sunlight, freshly painted, impossibly clean for vehicles that had crossed half a continent of war. He remembered the slogans he had heard in Germany. America was weak, divided, ruled by Jews and businessmen who cared more for money than honor. Yet here they came with engines that purred instead of coughed, with rifles that shone, with soldiers who moved like men who had already won the world. When the Americans finally surrounded the remnants of the Afrika Korps near Bizerta, the Germans expected humiliation. Instead, they received water, cigarettes, and medical attention. Briner could not understand it. The enemy smiled. They spoke calmly. Their officers carried pistols, not whips. The prisoners were loaded onto trucks, real trucks, not the patched, oil-leaking skeletons the Germans had used, and driven to holding camps organized with machine-like efficiency. There was no shouting, no chaos, only order and quiet confidence. Even the guards seemed relaxed, their faces sunburned and open. It was a discipline born not of fear, Briner realized, but of pride. Days later, the prisoners were marched to the port. Row upon row of gray-green uniforms shuffled toward the waiting ships under the scorching African sun. Briner stopped short when he saw the vessel that would take them to America, a Liberty ship, the SS James Buchanan, its hull towering over the dock. He had heard rumors that the Americans built ships faster than Germany could repair them, but he had dismissed it as fantasy. Yet the guards proudly told them this ship had been completed in less than a week. Less than a week. He repeated the words to himself, unable to grasp their meaning. In Germany, building a vessel like this would take months, if not years. Below deck, the Germans were assigned bunks and given hot food. Real food, not the gray paste of army rations. White bread, meat, coffee with sugar. The sailors joked as they served them, speaking English too fast to follow, but without malice in their tone. Briner noticed something else. The Americans laughed constantly. Even in war, even escorting their enemies, they found reasons to smile. It unnerved him more than hatred ever could. Hatred he understood. Laughter was a power of a different kind. As the ship crossed the Atlantic, Briner began to see the full machinery of American organization at work. The sailors maintained their duties with a precision that bordered on art. Every rope, every valve, every schedule was obeyed without question, yet without fear. There were no punishments shouted across the deck, no threats. The Americans seemed to work from an inner certainty that the system itself worked, and therefore so did they. At night, when the wind died and the ship rolled gently over dark water, Briner would lie awake and wonder how a country so vast could function with such quiet confidence. He had been taught that democracies were chaotic, undisciplined, ruled by greed. But here was a democracy sailing across the ocean like a fortress made of steel. Once he ventured to speak with one of the sailors, a young man from Ohio, who offered him a cigarette. "What do you do in Germany?" the American asked. "Farmer," Briner said, his accent thick. My father had land near Dresden. The sailor smiled. We got farms too. Big ones, you'll see. He spoke as if America's abundance was something ordinary, inevitable. The casual certainty in his voice made Briner uneasy. In Germany, certainty came from the state, from uniforms, from orders, from propaganda. Here it seemed to come from within. The Atlantic voyage lasted 2 weeks. During that time, Briner's world quietly unraveled. He saw waste. Coffee poured overboard, bread crusts thrown away, waste so immense it could have fed whole villages in Saxony. Yet the Americans did not care, not because they were cruel but because they had more. The idea of enough had no meaning here. On the morning of the 14th day, the prisoners were told to come on deck. Land was visible, an endless shimmer of light stretching across the horizon. As the SS James Buchanan glided up the Mississippi River, Briner pressed his hands to the rail and stared. The skyline of New Orleans emerged from the mist like something out of myth. Towers, bridges, cranes, and most astonishing of all, lights, electric lights, even though it was midday. The docks were alive with motion, cranes swinging, trucks backing, workers shouting. Everything moved in harmony as if guided by some unseen conductor. Briner's throat tightened. For 3 years, Germany had known only darkness, air raids, ration cards, and propaganda that promised final victory while cities crumbled. Here, on the other side of the ocean, was a nation blazing with life. As they disembarked under the watchful eyes of their guards, Briner caught sight of a woman on the dock, a civilian wearing a white summer dress and carrying a newspaper under her arm. She paused to watch the Germans shuffle past, her expression curious, not hateful. For a moment her gaze met his and she smiled faintly. That single gesture, a smile from the enemy, struck him harder than defeat itself. That night, lying in a wooden barack in the New Orleans processing camp, Briner could still see the lights of the city flickering through the small window. The hum of generators, the distant rhythm of trains, the faint smell of oil and food in the humid air. It all felt unreal. He thought of his father's words before the war. Strength is not in shouting, Carl. It's in what a man can build. Now he understood. Germany had shouted. America had built. And as the Liberty ships multiplied, as the lights burned without end, as laughter echoed from their captives, Briner realized something he could not yet admit aloud. Perhaps they had lost not only the war, but the argument of what civilization truly meant. The train rolled westward through the American South, its wheels humming a rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of a continent untouched by war. Through the grimy windows, Carl Briner watched a land unfold that defied everything he had been taught to believe. Rivers glinted beneath bridges of shining steel, and the fields stretched so far they seemed to merge with the horizon. Even the smallest towns blazed with electric lights that glowed long after sunset, an impossible sight for men who had lived under blackout curtains since 1940. Every farmhouse had a truck in its yard, every barn a radio humming with music. The prisoners whispered among themselves that this could not be real. Otto Weiss leaned closer to Briner and muttered, "No country at war could live like this." Briner said nothing. He could only stare at the endless procession of abundance, the children waving flags at the passing train, the women hanging clean laundry beside gleaming automobiles, the workers smiling as if victory were already theirs. The air smelled of grass and gasoline, not smoke or fear. When the train finally halted at Camp Huntsville, the prisoners braced for cruelty. Instead they found neat wooden barracks, water that ran clear and cold, and electric fans spinning lazily in the Texas heat. The guards were young, their uniforms tidy but relaxed, their laughter genuine, no barking of orders, no fists, no hatred. Briner studied them and felt an unease deeper than fear. These men commanded not through threat, but through quiet certainty. They carried their authority like they carried their rifles, lightly as if strength required no performance. For the first time he sensed that Germany had not been defeated merely by weapons, but by a spirit that could build abundance even in war. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the fields outside Camp Huntsville, and the rhythmic sound of hooves echoed through the dry Texas air. The German prisoners, weary and wary, turned their heads toward the western fence, their eyes widening in disbelief. At first they thought it might be an American cavalry unit, a show of military strength. But as the riders drew closer, it became clear these were no soldiers. They wore broad-brimmed hats instead of helmets, denim instead of uniforms, and rode with a casual grace that seemed almost unreal. Their rifles rested easily in saddle scabbards, not as instruments of intimidation but as tools of their trade. Ahead of them moved a small herd of cattle, dust rising in golden plumes against the Texas sun. The scene was like something out of a dream or a film, something the Nazi propaganda had mocked as an American fantasy. The men behind the barbed wire pressed forward, shading their eyes, murmuring to one another, "Cowboys, real ones." Karl Briner stood among them, his hands gripping the wire, watching as the riders passed. The horses moved with power and precision, muscles rippling beneath sleek coats. The riders were sun-browned, lean, and silent except for occasional shouts to the herd. "Are you real cowboys?" someone yelled in halting English. The lead rider, a man with a red bandana around his neck and a revolver on his hip, turned in his saddle, grinned and called back, "Sure are, boys. Welcome to Texas." Laughter rippled through the prisoners like wind through grass. Even the guards smiled. For a moment, the war, the fences, the uniforms, all of it seemed to dissolve under the simple humanity of that exchange. Briner could not take his eyes off the cowboys. They rode with a quiet confidence that no German officer had ever possessed. They didn't shout orders or march in unison. They didn't need to. Everything about them spoke of independence, of men who obeyed no one but their own code. They looked like figures from another age, yet somehow they fit perfectly into this strange modern America that pulsed with machinery, electricity, and light. Here the old and the new lived side by side and both seemed to flourish. When the herd had passed, the prisoners remained by the fence, watching the dust settle in the heat. Otto Eis shook his head in disbelief. "They look like men from a story," he said softly. "Free men." Briner said nothing. He could only nod. For 3 years, he had lived under the shadow of a government that had reduced freedom to a slogan and pride to obedience. Here, beyond the wire, he had seen men who embodied both without arrogance. That night the camp hummed with talk of the cowboys. Some prisoners laughed it off as theater, a deliberate show meant to impress them. Others argued that no army could stage something so effortless. The Americans were too casual, too genuine. "They have no fear," one man said, "because they have nothing to fear." The phrase echoed in Briner's mind as he lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling fan turning lazily above him. He took out his diary and began to write by the dim light of the electric bulb. "They do not act like conquerors," he wrote. "They act like men who have nothing to prove." The pencil paused. "If this is the spirit of America, then we never understood our enemy." The next morning, Briner went to work detail outside the perimeter. The guards drove the prisoners in trucks to a nearby field where they were to cut timber for fence repair. Along the way they passed a small ranch. A boy no older than 16 rode beside the truck, tipping his hat with a grin before galloping off to round up stray cattle. The guard beside Briner laughed. "That kid's been riding since he could walk," he said proudly. "His daddy fought in the last war. He'll probably join the next one." The word stuck with Briner. In Germany, sons inherited fear and obedience. Here they seemed to inherit confidence. That evening, as the prisoners returned to camp, the same cowboys were visible again, riding along the far ridge. The setting sun painted them in gold and shadow, silhouettes against the horizon. Briner thought of the posters back home, the ones showing America as a place of corruption, greed, and weakness. He realized now how wrong they had been. The weakness Germany had mocked was not weakness at all. It was freedom, the ability to laugh without permission, to live without fear, to ride across open land without bowing to any flag or Führer. By the time darkness fell, the story of the cowboys had already become legend. Prisoners repeated the exchange, "Are you real cowboys?" "Sure are, boys." With laughter and awe, even the most fanatical among them fell silent when the topic arose. For men who had been taught that America was collapsing, the sight of those riders was unbearable proof that the opposite was true. The United States was not crumbling under the weight of freedom. It was thriving because of it. Briner would later write that it was on that day, not in battle, not in surrender, but at the fence in Texas, that he first began to understand what had defeated them. The Americans did not need to preach democracy. They lived it. It was in the way they rode, the way they worked, the way they laughed. The cowboys had carried no flags, made no speeches, fired no shots. Yet their mere existence had done what armies could not. They had shown the prisoners what freedom looked like. As Briner drifted to sleep that night, the image of the riders lingered in his mind, the dust, the sunlight, the laughter. Somewhere beyond the fence, a coyote howled, and a guard hummed a tune under his breath. The sound mingled with the distant rhythm of hooves fading into the Texas dusk, a rhythm that would echo in Briner's memory long after the war was over. Weeks turned into months and life inside Camp Huntsville began to take on a strange rhythm, half prison, half university. The war beyond the fences still raged, but inside time moved differently. For men who had once lived by the sound of artillery, The hum of electric lights and the clang of meal trays became the new soundtrack of existence. At first, the routine was met with suspicion. The Germans waited for cruelty, for punishment, for some reminder that they were conquered. Instead, they found rules grounded in fairness, discipline tempered by dignity. The Americans followed the Geneva Convention, not grudgingly but proudly, as though decency itself were a kind of victory. In the early mornings, Briner often stood outside the barrack steps, watching the sun rise through the barbed wire. The guards would stroll past with mugs of coffee, joking among themselves, rifles slung lazily over their shoulders. They never barked orders, never struck a man. That was what unsettled the prisoners most. The American strength required no shouting. Even their kindness carried authority. By the end of the first month, the camp had acquired something few of the prisoners had expected: a library. Boxes of donated books arrived from nearby colleges and towns, some in English, others in German. Briner held his first American book like a relic, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The paper yellowed, but the words alive with a kind of freedom he had never encountered before. The camp also subscribed to American newspapers, which the guards distributed weekly. For the first time in years, Briner read news that wasn't filtered through propaganda. There were no hysterical headlines, no slogans, no declarations of destiny, just facts presented plainly as if truth required no embellishment. Soon the lectures began. Professors from the University of Texas and local teachers volunteered to speak to the prisoners. They gave talks on history, science, economics, even American law. The first lecture Briner attended was about the Constitution. The speaker, a gray-haired man in a seersucker suit, stood before an audience of men who had sworn oaths to a Führer and spoke quietly of rights that belonged to every human being. He explained that no man, not even the president, stood above the law. Briner listened, skeptical but fascinated. In Germany, law existed to serve power. Here it seemed to restrain it. English classes filled quickly. Dozens of men sat at wooden tables repeating words and phrases, stumbling through grammar, laughing at their own mistakes. Learning the enemy's language was not an act of submission. It was survival, curiosity, perhaps even admiration. Briner found himself among the eager students repeating freedom, justice, opportunity until the words began to feel less foreign on his tongue. The teacher, a young American corporal named Harris, had a patient way of explaining things. One day Briner asked him why the guards treated them so well. Harris thought for a moment before answering, "Because we don't have to hate you to beat you." That idea lingered in Briner's mind like an echo. A few days later, he overheard another guard explaining to a new recruit why they handled the prisoners gently. "We don't beat them because we don't have to," the guard said. "We already won." It struck Briner as more than arrogance. There was something deeper in that statement, an understanding that real victory was not about domination but about control without cruelty. The Americans were not performing their decency for show. It was who they were. As the months passed, the prisoners at Camp Huntsville found themselves slowly drawn into a world that was both foreign and strangely familiar. The war still raged beyond the fences, but inside the camp, a new rhythm had taken hold, one of work, learning, and unexpected humanity. The prisoners were soon allowed to work outside the wire, transported by trucks to nearby farms and road crews where they harvested cotton, repaired fences, and fixed machinery. They earned small wages and camp script that could be exchanged for cigarettes, chocolate, or paper for writing letters. The guards supervised lightly, often talking with the men like co-workers rather than captors. The equality of it was disarming. In Germany, power flowed only downward, enforced by fear and brutality. Here it seemed to move in every direction at once. The prisoners began to see the Americans not as faceless enemies but as individuals, farmers, workers, fathers, people who lived by a different code. The guards shared lunches, swapping sandwiches for carefully folded cigarettes. The barriers between captor and captive began to blur. One day the prisoners were taken to the Wallace farm near Navasota. A stocky man in his 50s greeted them with a handshake rather than a salute. "Work hard, eat well," he said in a deep, easy drawl, passing out glasses of cold lemonade. The liquid was sweet and shockingly cold against the Texas heat, and for a moment Briner forgot he was a prisoner. The men were shown the fields, rows upon rows of cotton stretching beyond sight. The machines scattered across the land were unlike anything Briner had ever seen. Tractors twice the size of German models rumbled across the soil, their engines roaring like thunder. Electric pumps drew water from deep wells, sending streams through steel pipes that glittered in the sun. Mechanical pickers gathered cotton faster than 100 men could by hand. The efficiency was mesmerizing. Where German farms relied on muscle and sweat, Here machines multiplied labor as if by magic. The prisoners began their work at dawn, the air still cool before the Texas sun climbed high. The guards lounged in the shade, drinking coffee, while the Germans bent to their tasks. There was no shouting, no whips, only the steady rhythm of work and the occasional voice of Henry Wallace, calling instructions in simple English. He treated the prisoners like hired men, not enemies. "Mind the roots," he'd say, gesturing to Breener with a nod. "You break the plant, you'll slow the next pickinda." His tone was firm but patient like a teacher's. At noon, the men rested in the shade of the barn. Wallace's wife, a cheerful woman with sun-reddened arms, brought them sandwiches and bottles of milk. Breener stared at the food in disbelief. Thick slices of bread, layers of meat, even tomatoes. In Germany, such meals had vanished years ago. When he hesitated to take one, she smiled kindly. "Eat, son," she said. "You're no good to anyone hungry." The word son struck him more deeply than he expected. That evening, as the day's light faded to amber, Breener helped Wallace repair a broken plow. The farmer worked beside him in silence until the job was done. Then he leaned on the tool handle and said, "You boys ain't so different from us. Just got stuck on the wrong side is all." Breener could find no answer. He only nodded, ashamed and grateful all at once. Dinner at the farmhouse was another shock. The table groaned with food: roast beef, corn on the cob, potatoes, milk so fresh it still smelled faintly of grass. Wallace invited the prisoners to join him and his family. They refused at first, embarrassed, but he waved off their protests. "Ain't right eatin' while others watch," he said. So they sat awkwardly at first, while the farmer's children stared with wide eyes at the enemy soldiers sitting at their table. Conversation was hesitant, broken by laughter as the Wallace family tried their few German words, and the prisoners answered with halting English. The tension melted. For the first time since capture, Breener felt like a human being again. Later, walking back to the barn that served as their quarters, he looked up at the Texas night. The sky blazed with stars brighter than anything he had seen, even in the desert. The air smelled of grass and soil, alive and clean. He thought of his father's farm back in Saxony, of horses instead of tractors, of hunger instead of plenty, of fear instead of peace. The contrast was unbearable. He wrote in his journal that night, "They treat us as men. Perhaps that is their greatest weapon." Days passed and the work became routine. The prisoners laughed, sweated, and sang quietly in German as they loaded wagons. Wallace paid them with camp coupons redeemable for cigarettes and sweets. It seemed absurd that their captors gave them luxuries denied to civilians in their own country. When Wallace's youngest son caught a fever, Breener and Weiss repaired the fence alone without being asked. Wallace thanked them sincerely, his voice thick with emotion. "You fellas work harder than some of the boys are higher," he said. By the end of the harvest season, the boundaries between captor and captive had blurred. The guards sat at the edge of the field, swapping stories, their rifles forgotten in the grass. The prisoners worked not out of fear but out of pride. The war felt very far away. Sometimes Breener would pause, hands on his knees, and watch the endless sky above. The sun burned his neck and arms, but it also burned away illusions, the lies of superiority, the poison of hate. In those fields of Texas, he learned a truth no victory could erase. The same America that had crushed their armies was now feeding them, clothing them, teaching them. Its power lay not just in machines or money but in mercy. Beneath that boundless sky, Breener began to understand that a nation's greatest strength was not how it conquered, but how it forgave. December of 1944 arrived with a cold wind that swept across the Texas plains, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke into Camp Huntsville. Beyond the barbed wire, the world was at war. Cities burned, armies broke, men died on frozen European fields. But inside the camp, something different stirred. Small strings of colored lights appeared on the barracks roofs, powered by the same electric lines that still amazed the prisoners. American guards had hung them quietly without orders just to mark the season. The soft glow cast the camp in an almost holy light, transforming the wire and watchtowers into something gentler, almost human. The first sign that this Christmas would be unlike any other came when the Methodist Church from the nearby town sent a letter to the camp commander. They wanted to bring carolers, local families, children, and old men to sing for the prisoners in their own language. At first, Breener and the others thought it must be a mistake or some cruel joke. But on the evening of December 23rd, as twilight settled over the pine trees, the sound of voices drifted across the yard. The melody was unmistakable, still knacked, hark! The herald angels sing, Silent Night, sung in perfect German by Texans with thick Southern accents. Prisoners gathered along the fence, drawn by the sound. The carolers stood just beyond the wire, holding candles that flickered in the wind. Their faces glowed in the light, women in wool coats, children clutching song sheets, men who had sons fighting in Europe. They sang not as victors but as neighbors, their voices full of warmth and sorrow. Some prisoners joined in softly, their own voices trembling. Briner felt tears sting his eyes. For years, music in Germany had belonged to the state. Marches, anthems, propaganda songs. This was something else entirely. It was grace given freely without condition. The next morning, preparations began for the Christmas feast. Trucks arrived from nearby farms and churches, delivering turkeys, vegetables, milk, and even crates of apples. The guards worked alongside the prisoners to set long tables in the mess hall. No one spoke of the war. For a single day, the world seemed suspended in a fragile truce. The camp commander, Colonel David Ross, gathered the men before dinner. He was a tall man with tired eyes, a veteran of the last war, and his voice carried quiet authority. "Tonight," he said, "we remember that even enemies are children of God." When the prisoners sat down, they found plates piled high with turkey, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread still warm from the oven, and slices of pie that gleamed under the electric lights. For many, it was the first real meal they had eaten in years. Briner stared at the food in disbelief. In Germany, his family was likely living on black bread and turnips, their city dark and silent under Allied bombs. Here, in captivity, he was offered abundance. He lifted his fork with shaking hands. Around him, some men wept openly, others simply sat motionless, overcome by a kindness they could not explain. The young camp chaplain, a minister from Waco barely older than the prisoners themselves, stood at the head of the hall and spoke softly. "We don't do this because you deserve it," he said. "We do it because it's who we are." The words hung in the air like a benediction. Briner felt them strike something deep within him. In Germany, mercy had been weakness, compassion a flaw. Here mercy was strength. He realized then that America's power did not come from their machines or their weapons, but from their ability to forgive even in victory. The days following that Christmas were marked by a quiet transformation within Camp Huntsville. The prisoners, once hardened soldiers of a defeated army, began to shed layers of suspicion and bitterness. The war outside the fences still raged, but inside, a new reality was taking shape, one where humanity and dignity were not casualties of conflict but its unexpected survivors. Karl Briner found himself drawn deeper into this strange new world. The camp had become more than a prison, it was a place of learning and reflection. The library, once a modest collection of donated books, grew steadily. Prisoners eagerly devoured novels, histories, and newspapers, many for the first time in years. Briner held his first American book like a treasure, Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The words spoke of freedom and adventure, concepts that felt distant yet tantalizingly close. Lectures became a regular part of camp life. Professors from the University of Texas and local teachers volunteered their time, speaking on topics ranging from science and economics to American history and law. Briner attended a lecture on the U.S. Constitution, where a gray-haired man in a simple suit explained the idea that no one, not even the president, was above the law. The concept was foreign to men who had sworn oaths to a dictator who ruled by decree. Yet, Briner listened, skeptical but fascinated, as the lecturer described a system designed to restrain power rather than wield it unchecked. English classes filled quickly. Men sat at wooden tables, repeating words and phrases, stumbling over grammar, laughing at their mistakes. Learning the language of their captors was not submission. It was survival, curiosity, and perhaps a growing admiration. Briner found himself among the eager students, repeating words like freedom, justice, and opportunity, until they felt less foreign on his tongue. One day Briner asked his English teacher, a patient young corporal named Harris, why the guards treated them so well. Harris thought for a moment before answering, "Because we don't have to hate you to beat you." The phrase echoed in Briner's mind like a revelation. Later, he overheard a guard explaining to a recruit, "We don't beat them because we don't have to. We already won." It was more than arrogance. It was an understanding that true victory was not about domination but about control without cruelty. The prisoners were soon allowed to work beyond the camp's fences. Trucks carried them to farms and road crews where they harvested cotton, repaired fences, and maintained machinery. They earned small wages and camp script, which could be exchanged for cigarettes, chocolate, or writing paper. The guards supervised lightly, often chatting with the men as equals rather than captors. The work was hard but offered a sense of purpose. At the Wallace farm near Navasota, the prisoners were welcomed not as enemies but as workers. Henry Wallace, a stocky man with a firm but kind demeanor, treated them with respect. "Work hard, eat well," he said, handing out cold lemonade on a scorching day. The prisoners marveled at the vast fields of cotton, the powerful tractors, and the efficient irrigation systems. Machines rumbled across the land, multiplying labor in ways they had never imagined. Meals at the farm were another shock. Thick slices of bread, roast beef, fresh milk, luxuries that had vanished from German tables years ago. Wallace's wife brought sandwiches and milk, urging the men to eat. "You're no good to anyone hungry," she said with a smile. The warmth of their hospitality broke down walls of suspicion and shame. Evenings were spent repairing fences or sharing stories with the Wallace family. The farmers' children stared wide-eyed at the former enemy soldiers sitting at their table. Conversation was hesitant but filled with laughter and broken German and English. For the first time since capture, Briner felt like a human being again. Back at camp, the prisoners debated ideas that had been forbidden in Germany: democracy, free press, individual rights. The camp newspaper, once filled with crossword puzzles and sports results, began publishing editorials on freedom of speech and self-government. Former officers and soldiers discussed rebuilding Germany with electricity, education, and justice. The men who had once believed in conquest now spoke of cooperation and moral duty. The transformation was not without pain. Letters from home brought news of destruction and despair. Briner's wife wrote from Dresden, describing the fire that had devoured the city and the struggle to survive among ruins. The contrast between their safe, abundant lives in America and the suffering of their families was unbearable. Yet the prisoners began to write back, not as soldiers but as witnesses. "We have seen America," one man wrote. "It is not what we were told. It is what Germany could have been." Briner's journal became a testament to this new understanding. He wrote of the Texas sky, the kindness of farmers, and the abundance of food. He confessed that the Americans' greatest weapon was not their factories or weapons but their mercy. The guards, once distant, now encouraged discussion. "Better you talk about what comes next than what's gone," one sergeant said. As the war drew to a close, the prisoners faced the reality of returning to a shattered homeland. Germany lay in ruins, its cities bombed, its people hollowed by loss. Yet Briner carried with him memories that no destruction could erase: the laughter of guards, the warmth of shared meals, the songs sung in the dark. He had come to understand that true strength lay not in domination but in forgiveness. When the war finally ended, Briner and thousands of others boarded trains home. The uniforms were the same, but the men wearing them were changed. They carried no rifles, no flags, no illusions. Only memories of sunlight on Texas fields, of kindness beyond the wire, of a freedom they had glimpsed but never fully known. Decades later, Briner returned to Texas. The camp was gone, the fences rusted, the earth reclaiming the land. As he stood there, a group of riders crossed the pasture, broad hats catching the sunlight. A child called out, "Are you real cowboys?" They laughed and tipped their hats. Briner smiled through tears. America had won, not through hatred or force but by simply being what it was. The years following the war were a time of reckoning and rebuilding, both for the world and for the men who had once been prisoners at Camp Huntsville. Karl Briner, like many others, returned to a Germany that was unrecognizable. Cities lay in ruins, families were fractured, and the future was uncertain. Yet, despite the devastation, Briner carried with him something that no bomb could destroy: the memory of a different kind of strength, one born not of weapons or conquest, but of mercy, dignity, and freedom. Back in Germany, Briner found himself a stranger in his own land. The ideals he had once believed in, the pride, the obedience, the blind loyalty, had been shattered. He struggled to reconcile the man he had been with the man he was becoming. The lessons learned in Texas, the kindness shown by former enemies, and the glimpse of a society built on respect rather than fear haunted his thoughts. He began to speak quietly to neighbors and friends about his experiences. He told them of the farmers who had welcomed him, the guards who had treated him with respect, and the Christmas carols sung in German by Americans who had every reason to hate him. His stories were met with disbelief, suspicion, and sometimes outright hostility. Many could not fathom that the enemy had shown such humanity. Yet over time these stories planted seeds of change. The men who had once been soldiers of the Reich became ambassadors of a new understanding. They spoke of democracy not as a distant ideal but as a lived reality they had witnessed firsthand. They shared the idea that freedom was not just a political concept but a way of life, one that required trust, respect, and the courage to forgive. Briner's own journey was one of quiet transformation. He returned to farming, applying the lessons he had learned about efficiency and cooperation. He taught his children English, hoping to bridge the gap between the old world and the new. He kept a journal, a record of his thoughts and memories, a testament to the power of mercy over might. In America, the legacy of Camp Huntsville lived on in the relationships forged between former prisoners and their captors. Many of the guards and farmers who had worked alongside the Germans maintained correspondence with the men they had once guarded. Letters crossed the ocean, carrying stories of reconciliation and hope. The camp itself became a symbol of what war could be, and what it should never be. It stood as a reminder that even in the darkest times humanity could endure. The kindness shown within its fences challenged the narrative of hatred and division that had fueled the conflict. Decades later, Briner returned to Texas. The camp was gone, the fences rusted, and the earth had reclaimed the land. Yet, as he stood in the fading light, he saw the same spirit that had touched him so many years before. A group of riders crossed the pasture, their broad hats catching the sun. A child called out, "Are you real cowboys?" The riders laughed and tipped their hats in greeting. Briner smiled through tears. America had won, not through hatred or domination but by simply being true to its values. The cowboys, the farmers, the guards, they had shown a strength that no army could match. They had embodied a freedom that was both fierce and forgiving. The story of Camp Huntsville is not just a tale of war and captivity. It is a story of transformation, of the power of kindness to break down walls, and of the enduring human spirit. It reminds us that victory is not measured solely by battles won or enemies defeated, but by the ability to uphold dignity and mercy even in the face of conflict. For Karl Briner and the men who shared his journey, the war ended not with a final shot fired, but with a quiet understanding, a recognition that the true strength of a nation lies in its capacity to forgive and to build anew. The war had ended, but for Karl Briner and countless others, the true battle was just beginning, a battle within themselves to reconcile the past with the future. They returned to a shattered homeland, carrying memories of kindness and freedom that contrasted starkly with the ruins around them. The lessons learned behind barbed wire in Texas, the power of mercy, dignity, and respect, became a beacon of hope in a world desperate for healing. Briner understood that America's greatest victory was not in its factories or armies, but in its ability to live its ideals even in times of war. The cowboys who rode past the fence, the farmers who shared their tables, and the guards who treated prisoners as men had shown a strength far deeper than any weapon. They had embodied a freedom that was both fierce and forgiving, a freedom that could transform enemies into witnesses of humanity. As Briner looked back on his journey, he realized that the true measure of victory was not domination, but the capacity to forgive and rebuild. The story of Camp Huntsville stands as a testament to the enduring power of compassion and the resilience of the human spirit. It reminds us that even in the darkest hours, kindness can light the way to a better tomorrow. And so, beneath the vast Texas sky where cowboys still ride, the legacy of that summer day lives on. A legacy not of war but of hope, understanding, and the quiet strength of a nation that won by simply being what it was meant to be.